One of the questions I often get asked is, well, what the heck is a Disney historian? A lot of you are familiar with Dave Smith. Dave Smith is, or was, he just recently retired, a Disney archivist. And what an archivist does, and that's an official role in the Disney company, what an archivist does is very similar to what a librarian does. They gather material, they catalog material, so that you know this book has something on Snow White, or this magazine has information from the 1930s, whatever. And they preserve that material so that material can be used. What a Disney historian does is take that information and connect the dots into stories, because stories are very important to us. Stories appeal to our reason and to our emotion. In fact, stories are how we structure information and transfer information. Fairy tales were in a community, at a culture that was not literate. But you had to pass on information about morals. You had to, how do you behave? How do you survive? All of that. So the story of Little Red Riding Hood was to warn young girls to be very careful of strange wolves in their bed. Even if they look harmless, even if they sound like their grandmother, the wolf might have another agenda. That's the story of Little Red Riding Hood. One of the things that is a Disney difference that is very important is that Disney really touches our emotions. I'm sure that many of you are here today because you're huge Disney fans. You've been to the Disney parks. You see little girls dressed up as Ariel the Little Mermaid or as Belle from Beauty and the Beast. But you know, no matter how often you go, you really don't see little girls dressed up as Esmeralda, you know, from Hunchback of Notre Dame. And I think, well, Esmeralda, she's a beautiful woman. She's independent, you know. This is terrific. How come there's not that emotional connection? It comes down to story. The story of Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast is exactly the same story. The core story is that if you love someone enough, or someone loves you enough, the power of love is so strong, it can physically transform you. Not just make you a better person, can physically transform you. It can transform a tail into legs, can transform a beast into a prince. If there were enough love in this room right now, I would be looking like George Clooney. And we would both be so much happier about that. All right? Now, what is the story of Hunchback? The story of Hunchback is, if you're a little bit different, but you're loyal to your friends, you're kind to animals, you're creative, you push yourself beyond your comfort level. If you do all of that, the pretty girl is still going to end up with the pretty boy. That's the story of Hunchback. And while people don't have that emotional connection, and why you don't see little girls dressed up as Esmeralda going through there. So a Disney historian has to go through and find those stories, because history is the stories of people. I know that some of you went through public school. I was a public school teacher once upon a time. I'm sorry. And I realized that some of your teachers told you that history is just names and dates. If that were the case, there'd only be 3 books about Abraham Lincoln. There are hundreds of thousands of books about Abraham Lincoln because there's so many stories, there's so many different perspectives. Now, the next question I usually get asked is, okay, Jim, I understand. Disney historian, you tell a story, you find this information, you connect this, what else was happening at the time to make this story make sense so that it can communicate to people. How did you become a Disney historian? I was no good at anything else. I grew up in Glendale, California. Glendale, California is a city that is right smack dab next to Burbank, California, where the Disney studios are. So as a kid, 10 years old, I would watch the Disney show on Sunday night with my brothers. After we would have had our bath, and we were there on the floor, and we were way too close to the TV screen, which probably explains an awful lot of things. And at the end, and this, I hate to say I'm this old, this was in the days before VCRs and DVDs and TiVos, and even video cassettes and all that. So what I had to do with my little scrap of paper and my little pencil is when the credits came up at the end, I would write down these names. Then the next thing I did is I went to the Glendale Burbank phone book and I would look them up. How did you make that move? I had no idea the difference between an animator or a storyman or layout or whatever, but I would phone these guys up. Now, about 80% of them were really nice. 20% thought that their friends had put me up as a joke to do that, because especially in animation, they do an awful lot of jokes. They'll put goldfish in the water cooler. They will put a rubber eraser on the light underneath your light board. So as you're trying to do these thousands of drawings, it starts to smell, and you don't know where the smell is coming from. So they thought somebody was making a gag. So the very first Disney animator that I interviewed, I was about 14, 15 years old, was Jack Hanna, who is the director of a lot of the Donald Duck cartoons. And I called him up, and he lived nearby. And so my mom dropped me off, and she said, and give me a call when you're finished. And I'm there with my little cassette recorder and my little school notebook and my pencil to do this. And I was there in my best Sunday suit, little black suit, little thin black tie. But fortunately, I was tall for my age. I was already wearing glasses, so I thought, I'm really mature. You know, he's not going to know that I'm a kid. You know, I can do this. But I got there early. Just like today, I got here an hour and a half early here for today's presentation. I got there a half hour early. What am I going to do? I told him I would be there at 1 o'clock, and oh my gosh, it's 12:30. So what I do is I'm going to have to kill some time. I walked around the block. Not enough time, so I walked around the block the other way. And then I walked around again. And finally, I had killed a half hour, and I walked up. There was 2 flights of steps to get up to his house, and I got there, and I rang the bell, and the door opened, and I said, well, Mr. Hanna, my name is Jim Korkis, and I've arranged for an interview today. And he goes, yeah, my wife and I were looking out the window watching you rock around the block, and we were wondering, why doesn't he come up? And so Jack was very, very nice, and Jack also was so nice about that he also said, you know, you should also be talking to Jack Kinney and all of that. So he'd phone up a couple of others, and eventually I just started to network and found that these people loved to tell the stories. And so I started to write them down for my school newspaper, for the local newspaper, then to magazines and all of that, and I had a great deal of fun. About 15 years ago, I moved out here to Orlando from California to watch over my folks because they had health problems. They've since passed away, but by coming out here, I gave them another 10 years, according to the doctor, so I'm more than happy with that. And I started to realize the more I was talking, especially to Disney cast members, that a lot of these stories had gotten lost. None of these things had been documented because Disney history is oral history. And so when you were working at the Disney Animation Studios, if you wanted to know something about Steamboat Willie, they say, well, go down and talk to Les Clark. Go down to talk to UB Iwerks and Special Processes. They worked on that. They can tell you what was going on with that. Same thing happened with Disneyland. They were pushed at the last minute to build Disneyland, and so a lot of this stuff never got documented. So it was like, well, what about that? Oh, talk to Ken Anderson. He painted the backdrop for the Mr. Toad ride. He'll explain to you what's going on there. Okay. It never occurred to Disney what happens when these people are no longer with the company, when they've left or they retired or they died. And so I thought, we better start documenting these stories. And in some cases, I was the only person who talked to some of these people, because I didn't just talk to animators and Imagineers. I talked to all. So I talked to Walt's chauffeur and his nurse and all these things. We better get this stuff down. But then, like a lot of you, I have a huge collection of Disney books. Do we really need another Disney book? Yes, lots of. No, do we really need another Disney book? And so what was it that I liked about these other books, but what was missing? And so as I went through there, I have over 36 biographies of Walt Disney. Some of them are foreign, some of them are children's biographies, so they're less than 100 pages, some are in comic book form, whatever. And as I went through there, I saw that the story of the Disney company, the story of Walt Disney, was so rich that a lot of things just couldn't be told. You know, sometimes they ended up only as a sentence, because you want to talk about the huge building of Disneyland. You don't want to talk about the fact that 4 days before Disneyland opened, Walt celebrated his 30th wedding anniversary in the Golden Horseshoe, you know? And so I thought, okay, I'll write those stories, but my gosh, when you say Disney fans, that covers a wide group. Some of you are interested in Walt. Some of you are only interested in the parks. Some of you are only interested in the parks in Florida. Some of you are only interested in original Disneyland. Some of you are interested in the animated film. Some of you are just interested in pins and vinylmation. So you're in the wrong presentation right now. But so what I did is I took and I divided my book up into 4 sections. So I have 10 stories about Walt, 10 stories about the Disney parks, 10 stories about the Disney films, and 10 miscellaneous stories, like how the FBI was investigating the original Mickey Mouse Club, and the story behind why Khrushchev wasn't allowed to come to Disneyland, and the story about Walt's housekeeper, who passed away not realizing she was a multi-millionaire. Because what happened is Walt, on her birthday and at Christmas, would always give her a couple of shares of stock and said, you hang on to these are going to be worth something one of these days. When she died, they were worth $9 million, and she had no clue, because she had no understanding of the stock market or anything else. So these are stories that are fascinating.